Hello, hello. It is me. And we're back for part two in a different location to talk about the books that that I got at the Boston Book Festival. I went to a couple different lectures and I was able to meet some authors. This one in particular, I just knew I had to go to. It sounded just like the two books that were from it were definitely made me think of my family history series because I said, oh God, this would be, really good and I could tie it into something that I'm researching. But the first one is called They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. And this is the cover. I'm watching the pretty leaves fall outside. Don't want to rake them, but they're really pretty. This is the author. This is what she looks like. When we read books, history books, we watch popular, movies about slavery. Usually the impression that you get is that the wife is not complicit with what's going on, is really, really feeling sorry, is the nicer one to the slaves, has no control over anything or say in anything. She just has to be seen but not heard, kind of. Well, this book kind of blows that out the park. This author went and did research and found that there were a good portion of female slave owners. And they weren't just slave owners that their husband passed and they inherited the estate. They were slave owners going into marriages, or they were slave owners, I guess, even single or widowed or what have you. So I find that interesting because I would never have thought of that either. I always thought, oh, well, just like what I saw in the movies and things, I didn't know that. So she basically takes a lot of, this is how huge the research is. Hold on. The section of her notes of the research of the book. This is showing you how much, of the footnotes and stuff of the research that she had to do to build the book. But she utilized, she was saying, some slave narratives and letters that talked about their slave owners. And then she was able to substantiate them with her research. A lot of it she did, in the libraries, but she also utilized Ancestry.com and pulled up, documents about property, owners of property and marriages and all sorts of different things to substantiate these documents. So and it's kind of twofold to me because I think that sometimes people think that sometimes the slave narratives aren't telling the truth. Sometimes that they may exaggerate or are just dismissed. So I like that this kind of is twofold. It's not only just, giving you an aspect of history that you really didn't know anything about, but it's also validating the words that came out of these former slaves. So I'm looking forward to reading this. It will probably take me a little while to read it, but once I read it, I will tie it in to my family history series, so stay tuned for that one. The second one, I'm just timing myself because I talk too much. And the next one is called Bound in Wedlock, Slave and Free Black Marriage in the 19th Century by Tara W. Hunter. This one, and I gotta just sign it too. And this one is she wrote a little signature to me, a little autograph. This one, I thought this one totally tied in because she pulled up some family. She has a family historian in her family, and she pulled up documents from their research about her family and tied it into talking about her ancestors that were married and looked at the circumstances around it and why some may not have gotten married and tried to find ways beyond just guessing of why they might. It might be that the owners didn't. I mean, she talked about how basically a lot of the slave owners would force marriages and unions that they wanted to create, and they didn't have choices that way. She talked about, even though that they didn't recognize their marriages, that the families did have their own ceremony and beliefs and practices for their marriages. So it traces all of the the legacy of slavery and wedlock, and it was phenomenal listening to her and looking at her slides. I really can't wait to read this one. This one was, I think, the marriage certificate from her family. You can't really see it, but there's a little picture of it in here. I think she does have a couple pictures in here of, like the broomstick wedding, jumping the broom is a tradition. So I think this one will be great, and it also will be something that might be able to help me when I begin to start writing more of the story aspect, and how to look at the context of things, and pulling that in with the facts. So stay tuned for that one too. And that one again is by Tara W. Hunter. It's Bound in Wedlock: Slave and Free Black Marriage in the 19th Century. The next one is by Maza Mengiste. I'm probably saying it wrong because I didn't look. This should tell you, this should be a pronunciation of authors' names. This is the picture of her back here. Very beautiful. She is an Ethiopian author, right? She's from Ethiopia, yep. She lives in New York right now. And she based this story. She's also written Beneath the Lion's Gaze, which I almost think, I might not have read it, but I almost feel like I've heard of that or own it. I'll have to look. And it's a phenomenal cover. But she based this on, it says, a gripping novel set during Mussolini's 1935 invasion of Ethiopia. The Shadow King takes us back to the first real conflict of World War II, casting light on the women soldiers who were left out of the historical record. I believe, if I read correctly, that the author based this also on either her mother or her grandmother, who was, were one of these soldiers in this war. I know, I'm going to say nothing about Ethiopian history. And I think this would be a phenomenal introduction. This is another example of something that is, a historical fiction that can educate. And that's one of the reasons why I do like historical fictions too, because they're not too overtaxed with so much facts, that there's a story there, but then they inspire you to read more. So I'm assuming after I finish this, I'm going to be inspired to read some other things about Ethiopia and the history there, as well as even just fiction. So this will be a great world read, and I'll let you know when I get to it. But it's hot off the press. I'm sure you'll see a lot about it on BookTube if you haven't already heard it yet. And the last book I saw on my way out, I was ready to go to dinner with my husband and my son. And I was walking through and I saw a room with books. I just walked in. I was like, well, there are more books in here. And there were no authors in here. But I found out later that this author was going to be in the next day at another workshop. So I didn't get a chance to see him. But this one is called What It Is: Race, Family, and One Thinking Black Man's Blues by Clifford Thompson. But isn't that it's a great cover, and even the back of it's great. And let me see if it has a picture of the author. Yeah, here he is. His name is Clifford Thompson, and his works have appeared in publications including the Best American Essays in 2018, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. So he's definitely published. I just don't, some things I just don't know. Maybe the journalist. My receipt. It says, I'll read this real quick, right? An African American writer's concise, heartfelt take on the state of our nation's of his nation, exploring the war between the values he has always held and the reality with which he is confronted in 21st century America. In the tradition of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time and Ta-Nehisi's Coates Between the World and Me, comes Clifford Thompson's What It Is: Thompson was raised to believe in treating every person of color as an individual, and he decided as a young man that America, despite its history of racial oppression, was his home as much as anyone else's. As a middle-aged, happily married father of biracial children, Thompson finds himself questioning his most deepest held convictions when the race-baiting Donald Trump ascends to the presidency, elected by whites, whom Thompson had refused to judge as a group, and who make up the majority in this country. Thompson had the country that Thompson called his own. In the group contradictory emotions, Thompson turns for guidance to the wisdom of writers he admires while knowing that the answers to his questions about America ultimately lie in America itself. Through interviews with a small but varied group of Americans, he hears sharply divergent opinions about what is happening in the country, while trying to find his own answers, conclusions based not on conventional wisdom or on what he would like to believe, but on what he sees. Isn't this a great little find? It's a little tiny. Look, it's only 164 pages long, I think. It's great for me, the slow reader. I might even read this during my, to wrap up my end of the year to meet my Goodreads goal. But isn't this a find? I mean, the two ones they talked about, James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates, are no joke. So if he's even slightly in the scale of that, this should be a really engaging book with opportunity for a lot of dialogue. So I'll let you know when I read this. But I just looked at the cover and I picked it up and bought it. I was just like in that buy-in mode. I didn't even look at what it was about. So it was a blind buy. And I'm happy and I'm pleased that it sounds like it's going to be good. Anyway, those are the books that I got for the last part. There was one other one. I didn't get to meet the author, and I don't know where it is. I'll show you guys it when I read it. But anyhow, I hope you guys are all doing well. It's starting to get cold here. I'm just not looking forward to being too cold. But I am looking forward to excuses to read. So that's the one good thing about the wintertime. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you guys soon. Okay? Bye-bye.